John Tokuhara and Allison Watanabe. Two names that began as doctor and patient but ended in blood and betrayal. He helped her create life. She took his. What started as compassion inside a fertility clinic spiraled into obsession, secrecy, and murder. Behind the clinic's polished walls, their forbidden affair grew until love turned into possession, and the woman who once begged him for hope became the reason his life ended in silence. It was a story born from science and desire, where trust became a weapon, and the man who gave others new beginnings met his own tragic end. John Tokuhara's clinic sat quietly on the corner of a sunny Honolulu street, its glass doors reflecting the soft gold of morning light. Inside, the scent of antiseptic and fresh orchids greeted patients who carried the same fragile hope, becoming parents. John had built his reputation on compassion and success. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and reassured nervous couples that miracles still happened, even when science seemed cold. To them, he wasn't just a doctor. He was a lifeline. But behind his professional calm was a man who had devoted so much to others that he'd forgotten how to live for himself. His days blurred together in appointments, reports, and consultations. His life felt structured, predictable, safe until she walked in. She was polite, almost shy when she first met him. Her husband sat beside her, quiet but anxious while she explained the years of failed attempts, the heartbreak of miscarriages, and the feeling of inadequacy that had crept into her marriage. John's heart softened as he listened. He had seen this pain countless times before, yet something about her struck a chord he couldn't ignore. She seemed to carry not just sadness but a kind of desperation wrapped in elegance. Over the next few weeks, their appointments became more frequent. She came alone most of the time, saying her husband was too busy to attend. John didn't question it. He told himself it was normal, that many partners found the process uncomfortable. Still, something about their private moments unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. Their interactions began to drift beyond the typical doctor-patient relationship. She lingered after consultations, asking about his hobbies, his family, even what music he liked. John found himself answering with more honesty than professionalism allowed. Her laugh was light and disarming, her words carefully chosen to make him feel seen. In her presence, the stress of the clinic faded, replaced by a quiet thrill he hadn't felt in years. She sent him thank-you messages after appointments, short notes that seemed harmless at first. "You always know how to make things better," she once wrote. He smiled at the message, but something inside him warned him to stop responding. He didn't. As the months passed, she became pregnant. The news should have brought distance, a natural ending to their closeness, but instead, it drew them together. She visited his office more often, claiming she needed reassurance, advice, comfort. John told himself he was simply being supportive. Yet the lines between compassion and desire had already blurred. Their connection deepened until it became something secret, something that couldn't exist under the light of day. The woman who had once been a patient was now someone he couldn't stop thinking about. At first, John justified everything. He told himself that life was complicated, that two people could fall into something unexpected. But guilt began to gnaw at him. He knew what he was risking: his reputation, his career, his peace. He started to avoid her, canceling meetings, keeping his door closed longer than usual. Still, she found ways to reach him. Sometimes she left small gifts on his desk, things that reminded him she was still there. Other times her messages arrived late at night, confessions of affection laced with loneliness. He wanted to pull away, but every time he tried, something in her words pulled him back. To his colleagues, nothing had changed. John was still the composed, generous doctor who helped families grow. But inside he was unraveling. The affair had taken on a life of its own, one he could no longer control. He had stepped into something far more dangerous than he ever imagined, a secret built on emotion, guilt, and temptation. And though neither of them knew it yet, the connection that began with hope would end in blood. By the time autumn settled over Honolulu, John Tokuhara was living a life divided cleanly in two. In the daylight, he was still the respected fertility specialist, measured, methodical kind. But when night fell, he became something else entirely. The quiet, disciplined doctor transformed into a man consumed by an affair he could neither justify nor end. Every moment with her carried both excitement and danger, a collision of guilt and desire that blurred his sense of right and wrong. What began with kindness had evolved into something darker, a secret that weighed heavier with every passing week. The woman he'd once known as a hopeful patient had become possessive, unpredictable. Their relationship no longer felt like a choice but a trap. She sent messages at all hours demanding attention, accusing him of pulling away. When John didn't answer, she appeared at his clinic unannounced, her eyes bright with emotion, her voice trembling between love and anger. He tried to calm her, to set boundaries, but every attempt only deepened her attachment. What frightened him most wasn't her persistence, but how completely she seemed to believe they belonged together. Her pregnancy, once the source of her joy, became the center of her obsession. She told John that her husband didn't understand her, that she felt alone despite having the child she had always wanted. There were moments when she hinted that John was the only one who truly cared, that he was more of a father than the man she was married to. John dismissed these statements as emotional outbursts, but deep down, a shadow of doubt began to grow. He couldn't ignore the possibility that she believed it, that she saw him as part of her new life, one that excluded everyone else. John began to notice changes in her behavior that made his stomach tighten. She followed him online, liking every post, commenting with hidden meanings that only he would understand. He caught her car parked near his home one evening, though she denied it when confronted. The messages became more erratic, swinging from declarations of love to veiled threats. She told him that if he left her, she'd make sure everyone knew what they'd done. He started losing sleep, haunted by the realization that he was no longer in control of the situation. At the clinic, John's focus began to slip. His staff noticed his distraction, but he brushed it off as exhaustion. The woman's appointments became excuses to see him privately, and he felt powerless to refuse. Every time she sat across from him, he could feel the tension thickening, the walls of his once safe world closing in. She began asking him questions that hinted at her fears, what he'd do if her husband found out, whether he'd stand by her no matter what. John's answers grew colder, more distant. The warmth that had once drawn them together was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence neither could break. When he tried to end things, she refused to listen. She cried, begged, and then turned to anger. She reminded him that he had promised her comfort, understanding, love. He hadn't meant those words as deeply as she had taken them, but now they held him hostage. She said she couldn't lose him, that he was the only person who made her feel alive. John knew she was unstable, but he underestimated how far she would go to keep him. In his private journal, John began writing about the situation, not as a confession, but as a release. He described feeling trapped, fearful of what she might do if he pulled away completely. He wrote that he planned to transfer his responsibilities at the clinic and take some time off the island. He thought distance might calm her, that she would move on once she realized it was over. But he didn't realize that for her there was no after. What he saw as a quiet withdrawal, she saw as betrayal. The woman who once looked at him with tenderness now viewed him as an enemy who had taken everything and dared to walk away. The love that had consumed her was now poisoned by anger. In her mind, if she couldn't have him, no one would. John Tokuhara started to live in quiet fear, though no one around him could see it. Each morning he put on his white coat, greeted patients with practiced warmth, and carried on as if his life was untouched by chaos. But when the clinic doors closed and the lights dimmed, his mind became a storm of dread. He had stopped answering her calls altogether. Each unread message glared at him like a silent threat, proof that his secret could explode at any moment. He told himself that cutting her off was the only way to regain control, but deep down he knew it was already too late. She had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and he had helped her cross it. The messages kept coming. Sometimes she wrote about missing him, sometimes about how cruel he had become. Other times the words were darker, coated with bitterness and menace. "You can't just forget what we had," one said. "You owe me more than silence." John deleted them, but the words stayed in his mind like ghosts. He started changing his routines, leaving work earlier, taking different routes home, checking his rearview mirror more often. The once calm and methodical doctor was now a man on edge, haunted by the shadow of his own choices. At the clinic, his staff began to whisper. He had grown distant, avoiding eye contact, barely speaking during meetings. A receptionist noticed a woman sitting in her car across the street several times a week, staring at the building for hours. When she mentioned it to John, he forced a smile and brushed it off, but that night he couldn't sleep. Every sound outside his window made him sit upright. He began locking his doors twice, checking his phone compulsively, waiting for something, anything, to prove the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. She appeared one evening just as he was leaving work. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She said she needed to talk, that she couldn't move on without closure. John tried to stay composed, told her that continuing to see each other was a mistake. But her eyes burned with a desperate intensity that made him hesitate. She said she had risked everything for him, her marriage, her reputation, her peace, and now he was abandoning her. John tried to reason, but her voice rose higher, trembling with fury and heartbreak. He left quickly, locking the clinic door behind him. But as he drove away, he could still see her reflection in the glass, motionless and watching. In the following days, her tone shifted again. Her messages turned cold, methodical. She spoke of consequences, of things that couldn't be undone. She hinted that she knew details about his life, where he lived, who he saw, even what time he arrived at work. John tried to convince himself she was bluffing, but then he noticed strange things. The light outside his home flickered on in the middle of the night. A note appeared on his windshield that simply read, "We need to talk." His fear grew into panic. He confided in a friend, telling him he had made a terrible mistake with a patient, that she wouldn't let go. The friend urged him to go to the police, but John hesitated. A public scandal would destroy him. Days later, he made a decision. He would leave Hawaii, close his clinic temporarily, and start over somewhere else. He booked a flight under the pretense of attending a medical conference and began putting his affairs in order. But as he prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. On the night before his planned departure, he stayed late at the clinic to finish paperwork. The building was quiet, only the hum of the air conditioning filling the space. He thought about his choices, about how a single line crossed out of compassion had turned into ruin. As he reached to turn off the lights, his phone buzzed on the desk. The message was from her. Just 4 words, "We're not done yet." John stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He didn't respond. He placed the phone face down, locked the door, and stepped into the dark parking lot. The air was still, the street empty. He glanced once more at the clinic sign, unaware it would be the last time he ever saw it. Somewhere behind the quiet calm of the night, a plan was already in motion, one that would ensure he never left the island alive. The morning John Tokuhara was found dead, Honolulu woke to the sound of sirens echoing through quiet suburban streets. His clinic, once filled with laughter and nervous excitement from hopeful couples, had turned into a crime scene sealed with yellow tape. The blinds were half closed, sunlight bleeding weakly into the sterile waiting room. Police officers moved in and out with grim efficiency, their voices low, their faces set in the familiar expression of disbelief that followed every senseless killing. John's body was discovered slumped over his desk, a single gunshot wound marking the end of his carefully built life. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing broken. Whoever had entered that clinic had come only for him. Detectives immediately noticed something odd. The building's security cameras had been turned off the night before. John's office computer was still on, and his phone lay on the desk beside him, buzzing with unread messages. It was clear he hadn't been expecting danger. The investigators began piecing together his final hours, reviewing call logs, emails, and texts. What they found painted a picture far different from the public image of a respected doctor. Among the hundreds of professional messages were dozens of personal ones from a single contact, a woman whose tone shifted from affectionate to angry to chillingly possessive. Her name appeared repeatedly, each message more desperate than the last. When detectives tracked her down, she appeared calm and cooperative. She said she had been a patient of John's and spoke of him with admiration. Her voice trembled just enough to sound sincere when she called him a wonderful man who had helped her through difficult times. But the investigators weren't convinced. Her timeline didn't fit. She claimed she hadn't seen him in months, yet surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed her car driving toward the clinic late the night before his death. When questioned about it, she said she had simply been out for a drive to clear her mind. The excuse felt rehearsed, hollow. As they dug deeper, detectives uncovered deleted text exchanges between John and the woman, revealing a relationship far beyond the bounds of professionalism. Her words shifted from warmth to fury within the same conversation. "You can't ignore me forever," one read. Another, sent only days before his death, said, "If I can't have peace, neither can you." The pattern was unmistakable, a spiral of obsession and resentment that seemed destined to end in tragedy. Friends of John confirmed he had recently seemed distracted and nervous. He told one colleague he was planning to take an extended leave, though he hadn't explained why. His assistant recalled him staying late at the clinic several nights in a row, always looking out the window before locking the doors. He had told her not to worry, that he just needed to catch up on paperwork. But that final night, something had gone terribly wrong. The investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events. John had stayed at the clinic after closing, preparing to leave town the next day. Sometime around midnight, the clinic's security system was disabled. The killer entered quietly using a key or code, someone who knew the building well. There was no sign of struggle, suggesting John recognized his killer and let them in willingly. The fatal shot was close range, clean, and deliberate. It was not an act of panic but of resolve. When confronted again with the evidence, the woman's calm began to crack. Her answers became defensive, her composure slipping under the weight of proof. Investigators noted her shaking hands and unfocused eyes. In her car, they found traces of gunshot residue and a handwritten note that read, "He ruined everything." It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to warrant an arrest. News of the murder spread rapidly, shocking the community. People who had once praised John as a beacon of hope now struggled to make sense of his secret life. The clinic became a site of mourning and curiosity, its windows dark, flowers piling up by the door. The story of the respected doctor and his obsessed lover became a storm of headlines and speculation. And as the investigation unfolded, one truth grew painfully clear. Love had not brought them together, but destroyed them both. The trial that followed John Tokuhara's murder gripped Hawaii like a storm that refused to fade. Reporters filled every seat in the courtroom, their cameras flashing each time the accused was let in. The woman at the center of it all appeared calm, almost detached, her dark hair neatly tied back, her expression unreadable. She sat there as if the entire proceeding were happening to someone else. But behind that stillness, the prosecution argued, was a woman driven by obsession and betrayal. They laid out a story that felt more like a tragic film than real life. A doctor who gave hope to families, a patient who turned lover, and a relationship that spiraled into murder. Prosecutors presented evidence that painted a chilling picture. They showed text messages filled with desperate pleas and threats, letters that blurred the line between love and hatred, and security footage placing her near the clinic on the night John was killed. They explained how she had used a copied key to enter after hours, how she had turned off the security cameras, and how the gun she used was one her husband legally owned. The motive, they said, was a mix of jealousy and fear. She couldn't bear the thought of John leaving her, of being abandoned after sacrificing everything. She had told herself that if she couldn't have him, no one would. The defense took a different approach. They argued that the woman was emotionally unstable, that John had manipulated her vulnerability during a sensitive time in her life. They painted him as a man who blurred professional lines, who created a dependency he later rejected. Their story wasn't one of cold-blooded murder, but of a woman pushed beyond reason, caught between love, guilt, and despair. They called it a crime of passion, an act of temporary madness rather than premeditated violence. Her lawyer reminded the jury of her once gentle nature, of the trauma of infertility and the emotional chaos that followed. Each day of the trial peeled back another layer of their secret lives. Friends testified about John's growing anxiety, how he had become withdrawn and paranoid in his final weeks. Others spoke of the woman's obsession, her late-night visits to his clinic, and the way she spoke about him as if he belonged to her. The details were painful, but they revealed a relationship built on imbalance and control rather than love. When the prosecution finally rested, the courtroom fell silent as everyone realized the depth of tragedy that had unfolded between them. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation. The jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. As the judge read the sentence, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. Her only reaction was a small nod, as if she had already accepted her fate. John's family sat in the front row, motionless. They had waited months for justice, but the victory felt hollow. Nothing could bring him back, and the story that once defined his compassion had become a cautionary tale about boundaries and broken trust. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed to capture every word of the final statements. People debated endlessly about who was truly at fault. Some blamed John for crossing professional lines. Others saw the woman as a calculating killer. But beneath the noise there was only sorrow. 2 lives destroyed, a family torn apart, and a child born from circumstances shadowed by death. The clinic never reopened. Its windows remained covered, the sign taken down, the parking lot slowly overtaken by weeds. At night, the soft hum of traffic passed the dark building where everything had gone wrong. Neighbors said they sometimes saw candles flickering near the door, left by former patients who still couldn't understand how the doctor who gave life could lose his own in such a way. In the years that followed, John's story became a haunting reminder of how easily compassion can turn into temptation, and how love, when twisted by secrecy and obsession, can destroy everything it touches. His name lingered not as a healer or hero, but as a man caught in a tragic chain of choices that led to his own end, and the woman who claimed to love him would spend the rest of her days behind bars, living with the memory of a life that began in hope and ended in death.